Thank you all for being here. Welcome. I'm KRISTINA WILFORE. I'm the conference chair and the vice president of EAPC. So I'd like to welcome you officially to the 23rd annual EAPC Conference and Polaris Awards. First things first, your Wi-Fi password is on the back of your card. So if you haven't gotten that. We're really excited to join you, be with you in this beautiful city, which without a doubt stands as a symbol of true democracy and all its ups and downs, as we're seeing and we'll hear about also in today's morning session. Upon considering the latest trends in global politics, we decided to take on the issue of polarization for this year's theme in the next 2 days. So we will be exploring the socio-economical reasons behind this trend. We'll look at how technological developments contribute to the polarization of our societies. We'll discuss the effects of the global crisis. We'll learn about some of the new developments in campaign technology and covering more recent trends such as fake news and some of the other things that we spend a lot of time in recent months and years talking about as industry professionals and as global citizens of the world. At EAPC, one of our goals is the development and support and maintenance of democratic process. And we know that in polarized societies, there's not much room for tolerance, for dialogue, for understanding, which must be present in any democracy to thrive. So that's why we wanted to put a spotlight on this issue. And we welcome hearing from you and your thoughts about this topic. We, again, are very happy to have you here. We have an extremely packed agenda. I will be the taskmaster trying to move us along and keep to time as best as we can. And if there's anything that we can do for you in the next couple days, please don't hesitate to talk to me or any of our staff who are helping make this happen. So without further ado, I would like to bring our two guests to the stage and begin our opening debate on polarization. We want to get the blood flowing, so we set up this kind of construct in order to really see both sides of the topic. I am very honored to be able to introduce George Papandreou, who served as Greece's Prime Minister on the outbreak of the Greek financial crisis, managing to avoid his country's bankruptcy whilst applying a series of structural reforms for modernizing Greece. Currently, he's the president of the Socialist International, which is the largest political global family. The Socialist International brings together 153 social democratic, socialist, and labor parties from all around the world. Currently, 53 members of the Socialist International are in government, and numerous representatives within main opposition parties. The SI has a consultative status, Category 1, with the United Nations. So please welcome us on stage, or join us on stage. And Dr. Nigel Griffiths is also here, offering a counter perspective on the topic I will introduce in a second. Dr. Griffiths was elected as the first Labour MP in history in Edinburgh South in 1987, the sole parliamentarian seat held by Labour in Scotland in the 2015 Scottish National Party landscape. Today, Nigel chairs the Midlands-based cyber security company Enforce Technology and advises the boards of several international companies, including Cambio Technology Systems, the leading IT supplier to the Scandinavian Healthcare Service. He is the co-founder of Armoon, the airline finance company. So welcome, Dr. Griffiths. Let me put some, yes, I can be in the middle, literally. Let me introduce our topic. What we have asked the guests to do is to give us a 10-minute argument on each side. 5-minute rebuttal, and then we will also open it up for question. So the theme being a Europe without borders. Borders should be open. People should be free to leave their country of origin and settle wherever they choose. Under the pressure of migration and social and economic humanitarian crisis, the EU is threatened to fall apart. Strengthening internal borders has bolstered right-wing movements all over Europe, weakening the values of which Europe was founded on. This has given rise to the polarization and deep political divisions. Freedom of movement is essential for equality of opportunity. As democratic states, access to social positions should be determined by individual talents and efforts, and not on the basis of characteristics such as class, race, or gender. So this is the premise in which we would like to hear the panelists' responses. And with that, I will turn it over to the Honorable Papandreou.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. Nigel, glad to be with you and with all these friends here. Talking about polarization, I think the issue of borders has been used as a conservative narrative to create polarization on the wrong issues. I'll give you an example. When I was dealing with the huge economic crisis in Greece, David Cameron, then Prime Minister of the UK, came out and said, we are going to close the borders of Britain to the Greeks if the euro collapses. Now, I thought about that, and I thought that was highly hypocritical. Why? Because he certainly would not close the borders to the ship owners in Greece. He would not close the borders to those Greeks who would come to buy huge mansions in London, and he would not close the borders for those who are taking their money out of Greece and finding tax havens in UK banks or somewhere else. So, in fact, we do have open borders, but not for everyone. And that's one part of the hypocrisy. Actually, he was partially right, because 450,000 Greeks left, young Greeks left our country. Doctors, engineers, computer scientists, they actually are doing well. They found jobs in Germany, France, here in the UK. They've helped the economies of those countries, but they've also helped themselves. And hopefully one day they will come back. So what I'm saying is the hypocrisy is that we are seeing an identity war, which actually has much more to do with a class conflict. To add to this, the border narrative does not deal with some of the real issues. Capital is free to flow around the world, but we're constraining people. You know what that means? It means that it's easy to exploit cheap labor, much more easy than it was in the past. Last year, 82% of wealth created worldwide went to the top 1%. The poorest half saw no increase at all. All over the world, the economy of the 1% is built on the backs of low-paid workers, often women. So that's a great argument for more austerity for the middle class and the poor, while the 10 or 1% make huge gains and create huge concentration of power. This undermines the social contract that we have in the developed world. Wage earners who see no rise in income, then they are easily directed to scapegoat foreigners. That creates the right-wing populism. But there's another hypocrisy. Where are the refugees we want to keep out coming from? Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, through Libya, Nigeria, Africa? Who have created those conflicts? I was there when we decided, and I was not happy with this. I was the one prime minister that said no when we went into Libya. It's chaos there. Syria is a result of the chaos we created in Iraq. So there's a great issue here of We creating problems. In Africa, a huge exploitation, business corruption. And of course, then of course we have this huge push of refugees. So is it the border that's the problem? I don't think so. Borders won't solve problems. It's too naive to think that cement constructs will solve these complex issues. There's a security issue. Some people say, well, we have security issues. Well, let me quote U.S. Navy Admiral James G. Stavridis. He was NATO's Supreme Allied Commander, now head of Fletcher School of Diplomacy. He says, we cannot continue to build walls. We must build bridges instead. Building walls was the 20th century failed strategy. Only way to deal with threats, whether it's terrorism or cybercrime, is through building bridges. And he says borders are also a fiction in a world where some of the biggest nations are Google, Facebook, and Twitter. But there's some positive aspects about opening borders. I live in the Balkans. When we had closed borders, minorities there were the center of tension, either feeling trapped or feeling used by one or the other side. As they feel that they can move more freely, the tensions have eased. What about hard borders? What about Ireland? You know this better. Secondly, I was a refugee. My father, my grandfather, my great-grandfather were refugees. I learned a lot in Sweden. Olof Palme invited me once to one of his speeches in his campaign. And he said, look, here, I had just come back from Greece, had been elected. We had refugees. We had Bruno Kreisky, we had Willy Brandt, we had Oliver Tambo. They went and became reformers in their countries. Refugees are change agents. Let's see them as a possibility for educating and becoming a large number, maybe not all, will go back and reconstruct their countries, whether it's Syria or somewhere else. Poverty alleviation. Immigration is the greatest anti-poverty program ever devised. It is said that if there's a mere 1% enlargement in labor force through migration, that would be more money than all official foreign aid combined to these countries. GDP, according to the Atlantic magazine, economists have estimated that a world of open borders would double world GDP. But finally, there is not only the economic, but there is a moral obligation. Now you say moral obligations, yeah, but these are problems, it's soft. No, the moral issue is an issue of our societies. We are democratic societies. That is our strength. Our strength are our values. What moral theory justifies using wire, wall, and weapon to prevent people from moving to opportunity? Is it not a human right to be free to move, travel, experience, learn, work, and love? And yes, when migrants or refugees do come to our countries, yes, they have to take on our customs, they have to take on our rules, they have to take on our values. That is important. They have responsibilities too, but we also have responsibilities. We should, maybe if there are problems such as benefits, well, let's see if we limit some of the benefits. But let's not stop them, let's not use hard borders to keep them out. In conclusion, when I was going through the crisis, I often said, oh, I'm just going to go off to a Greek island, play my guitar, eat my Greek salad, yogurt, fish, enjoy the wine, swim in the waters. And then, of course, yeah, well, Greek islands, but you wake up in the morning and then they have 100 refugees there. You know that down in the beautiful sea where those ancient ruins are, you also have all this plastic that we have created through our pollution. You know that because of global warming, we have migration not only of human beings but also of fish and others that come from the tropical areas and changing our ecosystems. We are no islands. We are not an island. And to the Brexiteers, the UK is not an island. We can only deal with our problems when we work together. And that means building bridges and not walls. Thank you.
Thank you. touching on many of the main points that have been part of the political dialogue, and I will turn it over to Dr. Griffiths to respond.
Sure, absolutely. Ladies and gentlemen, distinguished delegates, it's a great pleasure to be with you this morning, and it's a particular honour to share a platform with George. Of the many political rallies that I've attended, including President Obama's inauguration, the most electrifying one was in Thessalonica in 1981, when as a young councillor I saw George's father, Andreas Papandreou, galvanise 1 million people on the eve of an epic election victory that wiped out the lingering memory of the military junta. I agreed with the father then, and I'm going to find it difficult to disagree with the son today. I come to praise open borders, not to bury them. The fewer barriers to the movement of goods and people in the world, the better. But the European Commission has fueled the rise of the populist extremists by its narrow attitude and head-in-the-sand approach. Donald Tusk's intellectual response to the US President's levy on steel last week was to say, if Trump can be stupid, we can be stupider. Who says the European Union is led by great statesmen? The truth is that we in the European Union are masters of trade barriers and protectionism. No solar panels from China that might undermine our indigenous solar panel industry. No sugar from poor African or Caribbean countries that might threaten the expensive, illegally subsidised sugar beet production in the EU. An EU fishing fleet sent to strip Africa and African waters of fish and impoverish their local fishing communities. So much for open borders. As to the free movement of labour, what country allows unrestricted immigration? Of course, everyone wants the doctors, the brainy people, the entrepreneurs, the ship owners. But what about the poor, the dispossessed, the victims of war? Angela Merkel welcomed over 1 million refugees to Germany, but she didn't hire the passenger liners to transport them in safety from the shores of North Africa, did she? The theme of this conference, polarisation, focuses on the widespread public distrust in government. The sad truth is this, that political polarisation is being driven by economic polarisation, and millions of voters who see their own living standards plummet and who feel powerless to effect any change in the policy. And when the leading architect of Donald Trump's victory comes over here and tells a National Front rally in France last weekend that they should be proud to be racists, I say to you, be very, very worried. The right, and a fairly extreme right, is on the ascendancy in power in Poland, Bulgaria and Austria, on the rise in Norway, Italy, the Netherlands and elsewhere. People want open borders to gain access to cheaper goods and services, but the same people don't like these cheaper items threatening their jobs and their livelihoods. And they don't like it when incoming workers, used to far lower standards of living, accept jobs at exploitative employer wage rates, paying the barest minimum. Lord Stuart Rose, who chaired the Remain campaign in the UK referendum and was once responsible for 90,000 employees at Marks and Spencer's, he let the cat out of the bag when he said during the referendum, if we leave the EU, frankly, wages will go up. And millions of people responded to that by voting to leave. The most moving recent book on the dehumanisation of human labour was published last month by James Butterworth. In 2017, he worked at the bottom for a succession of low-paying, exploitative UK employers, living in filthy, infested, overcrowded lodgings in one job He was tagged with an electronic device covering 15 miles a day indoors, his 10-hour shifts scrutinised by bullying overseers. A day off, even with a doctor's sick note, got him a disciplinary point. A week off gets you the sack. This wasn't, by the way, a backstreet sweatshop. It was Amazon, and not far from here. The vast majority of his fellow workers were Romanian, fleeing a life of poverty at home, and why not? But getting precious little support from the EU's employment protection legislation, much wanted by some trade union leaders, themselves on six-figure salaries. The author of Hired, this account of low-wage Britain, also worked for CareWatch UK, with no qualifications, 4 days training, and 0 hours contracts. CareWatch employs 3,500 to care for elderly and vulnerable people. Staff get 20 minutes maximum per visit and are trained to ask loaded questions like, "You're not hungry, are you? You don't need your pad changed, do you?" Here in Britain, austerity, cuts in council budgets have driven out good employers and providers. Low skill, low paid work is rife throughout the world's richest countries, and the people who suffer it have had enough. Of course, austerity has been worse elsewhere, terrible in Portugal, and in Greece, dictated to by the Troika of the IMF, the Central Bank, and the European Commission. Policies have been imposed against the Greek people's will, impoverishing the population. Businesses ruined, people ruined, families ruined, a young generation with no hope, old age pensioners, some with Zimmers, tear gassed by the police for protesting against cuts in their pension. We're told the EU's there to safeguard people, but judge it by its actions. The political classes who ignore the drive to lower wages, who dismiss it, or who don't believe there's anything that can be done, that's allowed the extremists to thrive. They're handing the baton of power to these people. Surely no one can sustain the proposition we're debating today, that strengthening internal borders has bolstered right-wing movements all over Europe. Precisely the opposite is true. Weakening internal borders has removed each country's ability to make its own assessment of the level of population it can sustain. This in turn has fueled distrust of politicians, and that has allowed extremists to dictate not just the agenda, but in Hungary, Poland, and now most likely in Italy, to control the destiny of these countries. Well-meaning politicians throughout the EU, like Angela Merkel, were moved by the plight of millions of refugees. From 1999, I chaired the Scottish charity's Kosovo appeal. I spent time with refugees in Skopje, and later accompanied them back to KRISTINA and Mitrovica as they'd helped to rebuild their country. I applaud fellow politicians who speak out for refugees and migrants, but those who will the way must also will the means. And unfortunately, their laudable and charitable sentiments were not matched by the commitment of sufficient resources. Indeed, the opposite is true. In the age of austerity that followed the 2008 financial crisis, all EU governments cut back on their spending plans for hospitals and clinics, for nurseries and schools, for vital public services. So while the political leaders were welcoming the citizens of other countries, adding unwittingly to the hostility of voters whose pay was dropping and whose services were deteriorating. And the EU's leaders, all unelected, are part of the problem, not the solution. Their agenda of seizing key policy controls from national governments commands no support from voters. Their attempts to run a pan-European finance policy through the euro has been dishonest in execution from day one, and the cause of great suffering and misery. Their attempts to achieve a harmonised immigration policy is treated with contempt by governments like Portugal and Austria and Bulgaria. And throughout the EU, national politicians are running for cover. Their attempts at a common defence and a common foreign policy have done nothing to stem the misery in nearby Syria or North Africa, never mind more distant conflicts. And they fail for one reason. No unelected rulers ever put the people's self-interests above their own desire to keep hold of power and above their own self-belief, unshakable in the face of all critical evidence to the contrary. Throughout the world, people are demanding a greater say in the decisions that affect their lives. If we are to stem the tide of narrow, bigoted populists, we have to focus on the services that people tell us they consider important. And that must be led by elected politicians. It cannot be led by an unelected elite who the public neither voted for nor support. The demagogues are on the march. It's time for politicians who believe in democracy to champion an open, inclusive society, a society that protects the weak and defends millions of people feeling the ill effects of deindustrialization and falling living standards. Globalization has wiped out millions of industrial jobs in the West. Automation and robotics will wipe out millions more service jobs. The challenge for us Democrats is to invest in people and ensure they have a role to play, contributing to the economy, supporting themselves and their families, building local communities they can be proud of. Our task is to turn their growing resentment away from polarizing politicians and offer economic and social programs that give meaning and hope to people's lives. In the 1930s, in the despair of the Depression, country after country sought salvation in dictators and militarization. But Roosevelt replaced the politics of pessimism with the New Deal to lift people's spirits and raise them out of poverty. We need a new deal in the 21st century, a pact with the people to foster jobs, skills, and community work, to give people a tangible alternative to the politics of polarization and resentment. Thank you.
We will give the floor for a 5-minute rebuttal.
Thank you, Nigel. And as you said, I can also agree with you on many points, and I know you are a very successful politician to have been able to hold the only one seat in Scotland when Labour was hit. So, and you're very passionate about these issues, which I don't disagree with. What I, however, would disagree, or at least have a different approach, is many of these issues don't really have to do with borders. I would agree that the EU has a lot of failures. And the failings I have lived through with the Troika. I have lived through the failings of a non-democratic bureaucracy, which I agree with. We need to change. I've been a proponent of electing our leaders in the European Union institutions. There is a dehumanization globally, and I think what we need to do is humanize globalization. That should be the, as you said, new social contract. But I don't think we can do that at the national level only. So the EU has not stepped up to becoming a humanizing factor as it could have been, as being its major new role, I would say, in a global society. It's allowed for us to go into a race to the bottom, where actually it doesn't need, you don't even need migrants coming in to take low-paid jobs, because capital will just move to a place where there are low-paid jobs, but we can't move, and we can't control that capital. So what are we doing? What are we doing about the tax havens, where I had to tax middle-class and lower-class people with low wages? I had to cut their salaries, I had to cut their pensions, but there were others that could, through the banking system, they could take their money out, and I couldn't reach them. Legally, they could take their money out, some maybe illegally, but they could just move. These are things we have to deal with. It has nothing to do with borders. Actually, it has to do with borders because they don't have any borders, but we do. So I think we're putting the emphasis on the wrong side. I agree with you with trade barriers, yes, actually, but we should also look at fair trade. It's not just simply open trade. It needs fair trade, and fair trade would be positive both for the developing countries, the emerging markets, but fair trade would also need to make sure that we would why not ask to impress upon the countries that are developing to, rather than have the lower wages, and rather than we lowering our wages, have them push up their wages. We've been negotiating that, the progressives around the world, but that hasn't happened. But that would be another way, rather than demeaning our labor force. There is a race to the bottom, but when migrants come and take low-paid jobs, I was a migrant refugee in Sweden. I was a student, and in the summer I worked as a cleaner. I used to go clean offices and ships and schools and factories and so on. You know what I had to do to become a cleaner? I had to sign up to a labor union, to a trade union. I could not work unless I was a member of a trade union. I wonder how many migrants in the UK or in many of the other countries must sign up to trade unions to work. They don't. And therefore they undermine trade unions. They create, that's what populism is. So let's not blame the migrants, let's blame the fact that there are those forces that do want to undermine the social contract and do want to undermine the strength of labor and of our workers. And as far as insecurity is concerned, I would say that what's happened is that this attack on the social contract has given the capacity to have a politics of fear. That's what the right wing and the extreme, if you like, populism is pushing, and demagoguery, which I like is a better word than populism. What it's saying basically is, and you can understand that when somebody feels insecure, and somebody doesn't feel the respect, and I'm not being heard, and things are happening around me, and things are changing. You mentioned robotics and technology and so on, and artificial intelligence, and I feel somewhat marginalized. Then when you feel that your identity, which may be the only thing you have, somehow is compromised, you stand up for that, and that becomes then nationalism and racism and so on. So we have to look at the causes of the insecurity rather than just the politics of fear. One final point, if we had more open and regulated borders, we would not see the tragedies of so many dying in the seas. We would not see the tragedies of so many being part of this, having to be exploited by these mafias. So much money going into the underworld and the mafias that are trafficking humans, and of course trafficking many other things like weapons. And that I think would also be something which in the end would be much more beneficial for both those who want to find a better life, but also those who want to have this positive reception of these people into our societies. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And here's where I do disagree. The origin of our problems in respect of open borders is illustrated by the Schengen Agreement from the 1980s. What that did was allow anyone coming in to Europe at the weakest point to travel to areas they wanted, mainly Germany, the prosperous north, in fact. And instead of the proper checks being there at every phase, and of course the United Nations is very clear that if you're a refugee, you check in and your responsibility lies with the country that you arrive at, not the one you want to visit. Schengen put all that aside and caused so many of these problems. And whereas there is a view of Schengen that our sons and daughters can swan around Europe, enjoy the cultural capitals, that we can, with our degrees, move from jobs around Europe. The fact is that desperate people coming in don't have these qualifications. They are a lot braver than us. I say to my Daily Mail reading friends, if you were in one of these conflict countries or in an impoverished village in Africa. You would lie, cheat, or do anything to come across to a prosperous country, to get a job, to bring your family with you. That's what I would do. And so I don't have a low opinion of migrants. I think they're generally very brave people. But what's happened with the Schengen Agreement has been the rise in the people traffickers, the exploitation, and then the thousands of deaths that we see. And if Western politicians like Angela Merkel had reinforced her desire to help refugees by, for instance, commandeering cruise ships and sending them to North Africa, they would have stopped all that misery. But of course, they didn't have the reception centres anyway. So it's no wonder that the right-wing xenophobes, which are on the rise in each of our countries, have latched onto that and are capitalising on people's own fears about the jobs they've lost, as of course has happened in America. What we should focus on is how to tackle the polarisation. And the solution to that is, I believe, to control the movement of people and at the same time invest in the infrastructure and the jobs that people in each of our countries want. There is a barrier to that in the European Union, and if the leaders of the EU continue to ignore what is a clamour from below for help, a plea for help among communities that have been devastated by deindustrialisation, if they continue that way, we will see the rise of the right in countries that we thought would never see the right again because they suffered themselves from dictatorships. That's why we've got to have a robust policy and a policy of investment. And in that I do agree with George.
Thank you. We could go back and forth in this format for a while. I also like with our EAPC approaches not to start softly. We've gone right to the heart of the issue, session one. But I do want to open it up to questions from the audience as we have a few minutes before the next session, or reactions to some of the themes that were raised. It's all perfectly clear.
Thank you. I'm Sepp Hartinger from Austria, and I'm one of the founders of EAPC. I think it's not true that we say, okay, Merkel and Angela Merkel, those welcome the refugees to Germany. What would be the alternative for that? So the people that were staying in Greece and in the Balkan area and in Hungary, they were waiting there. Border was closed, and if you say, okay, there's no chance to go in, the problem would be at the southern part of Europe. So this was a case, an event only for 2015. That was a solution. And all these refugees goes to Germany, to Sweden and Austria, and all other countries in Europe didn't participate. I think that is a thing what we have to discuss. What is the solidarity in this group? Yeah, and I think just now we spent so many money in military issues. Every country is going up with the cost of military. So we have to take away the money from them and give money to the states in Africa and other places to give a better life there. And if you think back, if you go back in the history, all these European countries has places in Africa and Asia too. So they are responsible for the economy there, not only the people there live.
Well, of course, you're right. Other countries didn't participate. Poland is now under threat from the European Commission. And I'm sure if the European Commission succeeds in taking action against Poland, the right will be triumphant. As for Germany, my reading of the situation is Merkel made a very humanitarian, statesman-like statement 5 years ago, saying that Germany would welcome refugees. She recognised, if I'm not mistaken, in the recent election, where it's taken months to form a government, that the reason she was losing power was because that was not a popular statement, and she made a mistake. Just as David Cameron says he made a mistake, Tony Blair says they made a mistake. You know, the problem is that those mistakes were costly. They fueled the rise of populism. And I was in a Labour government that supported Tony Blair, so I'm as guilty of anyone. I now recognise that mistakes were made and have allowed the right to flourish. And the issue really is that countries, especially in the wake of 2008 and cutbacks in their own budgets, the public want their services protected and don't actually want to share their services in a downturn with people who otherwise they might welcome in. It's fine if it's boom, and we had a boom in Britain in the early 2000s, but not anymore, and we didn't plan for that. And the cutbacks are what has fostered the right. Now, it gives me no satisfaction to say that. I'm very much of the left myself, and when I was involved in the Brexit campaign, I didn't want to mention immigration in any leaflet, because that was not the sole thing affecting people in that referendum, whatever else you might be told. So we do have to focus on the realities, and I think the German Chancellor admits she made a mistake and paid for it electorally.
Yeah, I just wanted to add something to that. I think from my point of view, if we want to fight this polarization, we need to, and this sort of demonization of these migrants and refugees, we have to focus on the issues that are at hand. And you mentioned it, Nigel. You mentioned the cuts, the austerity, the inequality, the hit of the social on the social contract, the New Deal, and so on. These are issues which have really undermined social cohesion, and then it's easy to scapegoat migrants. I was looking at the statistics. About 4.1% of the European population, according to Eurostat, are non-EU members, that is, migrants. So it's not a huge number. There is, of course, a disproportionate number in certain countries. I would say, first of all, if we don't deal with some of these problems globally and in Europe, the problem is not going to go away. We are going to have more flows of refugees and more flows of migrants. And they will find their way. They are desperate, as you said. They will find a way to get to our shores. Secondly, I think the EU has failed in not burden sharing, but there are more innovative ways. If Europe did act as one, it's not just to spread around the migrants and the refugees into different countries. Let's assume that we had some money, which you mentioned. We do have some money. The European does have some money. We are paying for the welfare of the refugees. What if this was a European agency? And what if we said, rather than asking them to come to our country, just to wanting to go to Germany or to the UK, we said, let's give them some cash through a credit card, through a blockchain credit card, whatever, we can use the new technology. And they choose where they want to go, and there would be a stipend. You know where they would go? They would go to the cheaper countries. They would go to the countries where there is less expensive. They would come to Greece, and they would actually create jobs. They wouldn't go to Germany, because that's the money, that would be so if we had a different concept of how we dealt with migration, and how we dealt with, particularly with refugees, we could deal with it in a different way. But that would mean that we would have to have a European policy. And I think what we've seen now in Europe is a renationalization of Europe and a fighting amongst each other, criticizing each other. I saw felt that very much also when I went into the economic crisis. You know, all these Southerners, they don't work very much and so on. You know, in the end, we looked at the OECD numbers, we worked more hours than anybody else in the European Union, but that was the concept. But this stereotyping, I think, created a lot of polarization and is also fed in to the anti-migration and anti-refugee psychology. So I think we need to try to, as if we want, as a progressive, as you are, Nigel, also, we have to, as much as you said that because you don't mention this migration, we should focus on the real issues and not try to undermine this concept that the migrants are the real problem.
A 30-second rebuttal on that.
I mean, 400,000 young people have left Greece. There aren't the jobs for them or for migrants either. And we've got to recognise that going to the British public or the German public, the biggest contributors, we're putting in 10 billion, I think your net contribution is about 12 billion to the European Union, and say we want to use that to help migrants settle is not the main priority. And I think that we've got to realise that. And we're not the people fanning the flames. If we don't do something about this and tackle it, the people who are fanning the flames are the one, and they're in the ascendant.
And with that, thank you to our panelists for raising such important issues in our opening session. So I'd like to give you a round of applause while we